Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today, especially to those who watched for like 5 hours yesterday, watched us cover the march. That was a very exciting event. I hope everyone got the chance to participate or check out some of the content that we put out pertaining to that march in over 50 cities across the country. We got all sorts of fantastic content out for you guys. We got an interview with Marianne Williamson, Paula Jean Swearingen, Lee Camp, on and on. People on the ground talking about why Medicare for All is important to them, all sorts of great stuff. If you missed our live stream of that yesterday, do go check that out on RPIA's YouTube. We have quite an exciting show for you guys today. We're going to try to bring you some content from the ground. There's a demonstration going on in Washington, D.C. against the U.S.'s embargo of Cuba. This is obviously kind of a hot topic right now, considering the protests going on down there and the attempt by the conservatives in this country to sort of grasp onto that moment to oppose the Cuban government and communism. We know that while there are all sorts of injustices going on around the world, the United States, and in particular conservative Democrats and the Republican Party, tend to selectively decide when they're going to point it out, right? And Cuba being a communist regime, it ends up being one of their targets, if you will. Just to give one comparison, and I'm going to go into a lot more about this later, but just to give one regional comparison, regional-ish, in Colombia, there have been protests against the right-wing government. Have you heard anything about that in the U.S.'s mainstream press? Have you heard anything about that from the Republican Party or the conservative establishment Democrats? I haven't heard word one. How about in Haiti, where obviously, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later too, but Jovenel Moïse was assassinated a few weeks ago. He was the president who had overstayed his term, which the United States supported. Guess what? They've been protesting him for months too. Did you hear word one from the Republican Party or the conservative Democrats? Did you hear word one from the mainstream media about how Haiti's government is mistreating its people? No, because they were U.S. backed. Okay, I can go into example after example after example, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later. But right now, I'd like to bring you a short clip from the ground in D.C. We have some people who were covering the march yesterday for Medicare for All who are still there to bring us some footage from this demonstration. I want to ask everybody to please bear with me as I try to get back and forth between clips today. I do not have the fantastic Andy Kennedy behind the scenes helping me communicate and helping me bring clips up and things. So if it takes me just a minute to bring you guys a clip, I do apologize. But here is a short speech from the ground in D.C. Looks like quite a turnout there, everybody. Hopefully we will get some interviews, and I don't know if there are speakers or events going on. I really don't know a whole lot about what's happening there. But great to see people out marching for these issues. And I feel inspired this weekend, you guys. There's some true activism going on, and it's genuinely, as somebody who is usually quite cynical about politics, quite deeply cynical, to be really honest, I've felt inspired by seeing all of these people and activists out making their voices heard. I do want to show you guys a little breakdown here of the embargo itself for those who haven't kind of followed what we've actually done, our policies against Cuba. This is, believe it or not, this is Vox that did a breakdown of the embargo on Cuba, and they gave a handful of reasons why it needs to be ended. So watch this clip if you're not up to date on the situation in Cuba, and we'll come back and continue our coverage.
In an extraordinary move, the United States is pursuing full diplomatic relations with Cuba, but this won't mean the end to the economic embargo, which only Congress can fully remove. It's a comprehensive set of economic sanctions on Cuba that has existed since roughly 1962. It has been an absolute disaster for both the United States and Cuba. Here's 7 reasons why the embargo needs to end. Number 1, American diplomats in Havana admit that the embargo is a failure. The goal of the embargo was to put pressure on the Cuban government, economic pressure that was supposed to create popular anger and resistance to the government and eventually overthrow it. But according to a 2009 cable from the US's top diplomat in Havana at the time, that has failed to happen. 2, sanctions have failed to ruin Cuba's economy. Cuba has seen a fair amount of economic growth since the sanctions were created, indicating that there wasn't nearly enough pressure to send the economy into a full tailspin and thus foment rebellion. Number 3, the embargo has probably killed Cubans. The 1992 Cuba Democracy Act restricted the flow of medical goods into Cuba from the United States. This resulted in a precipitous decline in access to medical supplies inside Cuba. According to a 2010 review by 2 Stanford researchers, they believe that the lack of access to this medicine was responsible for several disease outbreaks in the country, including an increase in tuberculosis fatalities. 4, the embargo has not significantly reduced Cuba's human rights abuses. Cuba has a terrible human rights record. Among other things, it's one of the worst countries in freedom of the press in the Western Hemisphere, and it throws dissidents and bloggers into jail merely for criticizing the regime. However, there's zero evidence that the sanctions regime has done anything to make those abuses better. 5, almost the entire world opposes the United States' policy. For 23 years, the United Nations has voted to condemn the American policy towards Cuba. The last vote in 2014 saw 188 out of 193 UN member states opposing it in the General Assembly. 6, Cuba is not a state sponsor of terrorism anymore. Some of the sanctions on Cuba come from the US designated Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism because of its support for the Basque terrorist group ETA and the Colombian group, the FARC. Now, according to the State Department's most recent review, there is no evidence that Cuba is providing material military support to these groups. Moreover, Cuba is cooperating with Spain on the transfer of ETA prisoners, and it has been sponsoring a peace conference in Havana for the FARC and the Colombian government, one that appears to have resulted in a unilateral ceasefire declaration by the FARC. 7, a majority of Americans support normalizing diplomatic relations with Cuba, and majorities support relaxing major parts of the embargo, including restrictions on US companies doing business in Cuba. Now, Cuban Americans also appear to oppose the embargo. If the people who have the most reasons to hate the Castro government have come around to thinking the embargo isn't worth the costs, it's time to reconsider the policy.
So I thought that was a pretty decent breakdown, you guys. There's obviously nuance whenever we're talking about foreign policy and geopolitics, but Cuba here has been victimized by our blockade for decades and decades. And to the extent that it has harmed civilians, I think that's really incontroversial. I mean, when you're stopping medical supplies from getting to a country, you are undoubtedly causing harm to their civilians. And, you know, we do this with any country that we dislike or that we're geopolitically opposed to. We have sanctions against countries like Venezuela and Iran as well, just to name 2 others. And then we'll point to those countries and say, see how terrible their government is. And I just want to be clear, you guys, I'm not like a fan of the Iranian government, okay? But the United States rank hypocrisy here needs to be pointed out. Our foreign policy is entirely hypocritical, and it's not just as it pertains to sanctions and trade policy and blockades and these kinds of things. It's also with things like, for example, election meddling, right? We'll get all in a tussle over Vladimir Putin's, sending people on social media or whatever, like all these Russiagate, whatever, right? We'll get ourselves all in a tussle about that. But then what about when the United States like supports Juan Guaido in Venezuela? What do we say about that? What do we say about the, hundreds of times that we have meddled in elections in just recent decades alone? How do we excuse that, right? So the United States is constantly hypocritical and contradictory as it pertains to our foreign policy, and we pick and choose when we want to care about human rights abuses. I've mentioned this before, but while we're crying about the way that the Chinese government is treating Uyghur Muslims, we say nothing about what Myanmar is doing to the Rohingya Muslims. Well, that's geopolitically expedient, isn't it? While we cry about Cuba's protesters, we say nothing about Haiti's or Colombia's protesters, right? Awfully convenient, isn't it? while we're calling for investigations into Cuba for human rights violations, what do we say when the entire rest of the world wants to investigate Israel for human rights violations? What do we say then? Nope, we block that. Veto that. No, can't talk about that. It's so hypocritical that I do not even understand how a remotely serious person could view the United States foreign policy as being somehow coherent or somehow principled. We are the bad guys. It's just that simple. And that's not to say that all of our enemies are good. Like that shouldn't need to be said. But in our tribalistic political environment, if you say, I think the United States are bad on the world stage, people say, well, what about China and Russia? And what about? No, most every country behaves poorly on the world stage. Most all of them do. So to not acknowledge that we are very much not just one of those actors, but one of the most powerful bad actors in the world, probably the most powerful bad actor in the world, is to just ignore reality. But that's what the mainstream press in this country does. That's what, unfortunately, a lot of the leaders on foreign policy do, the people who have been involved with the Pentagon and intelligence and et cetera for decades and decades. And that's an area where, regardless of what happens in elections, you often end up with like the same generals running shit. You often end up with the same people in intelligence for decades at a time. So there's no democratic pressure or even perceived or potential democratic pressure when it comes to these issues. We cannot just vote in a new president or vote in a new Congress and see change. That's just the history shows us that's not how it works. So the deep state, if you will, stays as the deep state, and we kind of play political theater with our elections in many ways, at least as it pertains to foreign policy. So we'll be covering Cuba quite extensively, hopefully today. I'm hoping that we're going to have quite a bit of footage to bring you all. And, you know, it's a very important thing to cover for a number of reasons, not just that the Cuban people, you know, deserve to live lives of dignity and to be treated fairly and to not be victimized by our embargo, but also in the more geopolitical and systemic sense, and in terms of how we evaluate media coverage and messaging and narratives, right? So looking forward to bringing you more from DC. As soon as we have some. I do want to get into a kind of a light story here, you guys. This I find absolutely hilarious. Brian Stelter is on CNN, and he is remarkably, the word in this clip that was used, I think, is sanctimonious, and that just could not be more on the nose. Brian Stelter pretends he knows what truth is and nobody else knows what truth is. He's an outrageously pompous actor and commentator, and his show is even formatted and framed to be that he is effectively like correcting the media constantly. So this is oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the guy's first name, something Wolf, just totally blanking on it. He wrote a bunch of anti-Trump stuff. Michael, no, blanket on the name. You'll see it in a minute in this clip. But he went on with Brian Stelter. Just to be clear, I like neither of these individuals. I think they're both kind of jokes. But this interaction had me absolutely rolling. So I wanted to show you guys this, and then we'll come back and discuss a little bit about the media. Just give me 1 second. I apologize. Here we go.
You know, and that's what Trump does. He has spent most of his administration seeing people on television and immediately calling them.
But maybe that's how it works sometimes.
I don't want you to think.
Is that how it works? That's how you get access?
But I don't want you to think that what I said at that point was in any way inauthentic. I think the media has done a terrible job on this. I think you yourself, you know, you're a nice guy. You know, you're full of sanctimony. You know, you become part of one of the parts of the problem of the media. You know, you come on here and you have a you know, a monopoly on truth. You know exactly how things are supposed to be done. You know, you are one of the reasons people can't stand the media. I'm sorry.
You're cracking me up.
It's your fault.
So what should I do differently, Michael?
You know, don't talk so much. Listen more. You know, people have genuine problems with the media. The media doesn't get the story right. The media exists in its own bubble.
That's true. I agree.
You know, you got to stop. I mean, that last segment that I just had to listen to, of all of the people saying the same old stuff. Also, you're incredibly repetitive. It's week after week. I mean, you're the flip side of Donald Trump. You know, fake news, and you say virtuous news. You know,
we
there's
just
a
figure out what
problem
is
here.
real.
I mean,
I'm listening.
Well, figuring out what is real is not so easy, and
Right.
you know, most people don't want to turn to Brian Stelter to tell us what's real. I'm sorry.
Well, then why'd you bother coming on CNN a few times this week?
You know, I'm a book salesman.
Michael, I love talking to you. I'm grateful you came on. And I guess let's do it again in 4 years.
What an absolute embarrassment for Brian Stelter. Like, this guy just comes on your show and drags you through the mud live, tells you you're the reason people don't trust or like the media. You're sanctimonious, you're repetitive. And he's just like, yeah, no, I always love having you on. Why don't you come back sometime? That is so pathetic, you guys. And quite frankly, it demonstrates the extent to which in the mainstream media you fail up. Brian Stelter brings nothing to the table. Literally nothing. If Brian Stelter was in a true like free market environment, you throw him on YouTube and don't give him any of the institutional advantages or algorithmic advantages. You know what would happen to Brian Stelter? He'd get like 16 views on his videos. Okay? The guy brings nothing to the conversation. And Michael Wolff too. Like, honestly, credit for the honesty, because the dude's obviously an anti-Trump grifter, right? He's made this career out of the Trump phenomenon. But at the end there, he's like, well, I just came on to sell books. I hate your network, but I'm here to sell books. Imagine being Brian Stelter and hearing that. Like, I'm basically just being used as a tool for this guy to grift. Oh shit, I just thought that was really, really funny, and I wanted to bring you guys that because it's always worth pointing out how incompetent and sort of incapable the mainstream media is, and that they are really relying on being propped up by the institutional power that they have. You guys, cable news, it's not like people go turn on CNN to watch Brian Stelter. What happens on cable news is that they have a section of viewers who just leave the TV on CNN for like 10 hours, and most of the time it's muted or they're in the other room or whatever. Like, that's where they get their ratings. You see what I'm saying? There are a few exceptions to that, like the real the more like inflammatory commentators like Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson. They're kind of exceptions to that rule where people will tune in for them. But on the by and large, on these cable news channels, people just leave. It's their audience is seniors who leave the TV on. Seriously. So put Brian Stelter in any environment where he has to compete with actual commentators and journalists and people who want to talk about this stuff in a serious way, and he would just fail miserably. But I absolutely love that, you guys. I also like, I understand it's really difficult for it, like if someone calls you out live on the spot and you have to like represent your network. I get it, but that's pathetic. To just say nothing, to not defend yourself or your network at all, and just let Michael Wolff stomp all over you and then tell you like, yeah, I'm just here to sell books. Fuck you. That, oh my gosh, just hilarious. I just found that way too funny not to bring you guys today. Really just remarkable clip. I also wonder, like, do you think Michael like knew he was going to do that going in, or do you think that he just got pissed off and was kind of like, oh, screw him. I'm just gonna lay him out and fillet him live on TV. Oh man, I just thought that was quite hilarious, and couldn't miss bringing you guys an occasional funny opportunity. So we have a very exciting clip here. Medea Benjamin, who is with Code Pink. She's an anti-war activist. She was interviewed here by Roxana in DC. So let's cut over there and hear what Medea had to say.
Hey! Nice to see you. When are you gonna play guitar? After we do.
Bueno, yo voy a intentar interpretarme a mí misma para que puedan ver los dos idiomas.
Medea, is it okay if I interview you for Real Progressives?
Yeah, sure. Or maybe we do it. Do you have to do it now?
We're live right now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Hi, guys. Roxana Fuentes here. I have Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. She's here at the...
I apologize. I may have grabbed the wrong clip there. Give me just a moment. I am so sorry. I don't have anybody behind the scenes helping me out here. Okay, let's see if we can get that sorted out and get to the rest of that interview. Medea Benjamin does great work. If you guys don't follow her, she really does really fantastic work. You know, Code Pink anti-war activism is very critical, as we're going to talk today about with Cuba, with Haiti, all these kinds of things. So great that she showed up in DC and is being active and putting her voice to the right place. So hopefully we'll be able to bring you the rest of that interview here whenever we get the tech stuff sorted out. In the meantime, I'll move on to my next story here. I'm sure a number of you saw this, but I think it's very worth discussing. Jeff Bezos obviously did his little, I'm going to go to the edge of space for a few minutes because I have to participate in the dick measuring contest of billionaires racing to space. But he made quite an admission when he got back with his freaking cowboy hat on for some reason. I'm sure a number of you guys saw this, but this was kind of Jeff saying the quiet part out loud, and I wanted to make sure to cover it. So Jeff Bezos here admitting the game.
The crew of New Shepard. Congratulations, all four of you. Jeff, what was it like? Was everything you imagined?
I'm going to answer that question, but just real quick.
Please.
I want to thank a few people. First of all of the engineers at Blue Origin who have toiled hard to get this done. The people who build the vehicle, all of our manufacturing people. This is a big team. They've been working on it for many years, and they have done an extraordinary job of building the most reliable, most beautiful, most fun, I mean, I can vouch for that, I'll get to that in a second, vehicle. And we owe them a deep gratitude. And the people who kept us safe today, who operated the vehicle, our trainers, everybody, it's just huge. I also want to thank the town of Van Horn. This is a small and amazing little town, we're making a dent in it, and we appreciate you for allowing us to be part of your town. And then I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this. So seriously, for every Amazon customer out there and every Amazon employee, thank you from the bottom of my heart very much. It's very appreciated.
I think he actually thought that was going to be an endearing comment. I think he literally, in his mind, thought that that was an endearing thing to say. But notice he doesn't just thank the customers. He thanks the workers. Well, what are you admitting, Jeff? You're admitting that they gave you their labor so that you could go make this fucking space flight and so that you can be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. That means you admitted to exploiting your workers. Remarkable that he did not think that through. Because Jeff Bezos isn't fucking stupid, you guys. He's evil, but he's not stupid. How do you not oh, wait, that might not sound great. Maybe I'll keep it to the engineers about the craft and you know what I mean? Maybe we'll just talk about this project and thank everybody involved instead of me admitting that I'm exploiting my workers in order to have the wealth to do these kinds of things. Really remarkable admission there. Really remarkable. Amazon, as we've covered extensively, one of the worst companies in terms of how they treat their workers, and they are very rapidly on their way to becoming the largest private employer in the country. Only Walmart is ahead of them currently, but if trends continue, Amazon will soon, in the next year or two, overtake Walmart in terms of size of employment. Public sector, obviously, tons of employees, but Amazon and Walmart are the two top dogs in terms of private employers, and that does not bode well for workers or for the country or for our economic health. So, we'll continue to call out Amazon. We'll continue to call out Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson and their stupid fucking space race. Which, by the way, again, you guys, like, to celebrate this, Jeff Bezos just spent millions of dollars to do what Yuri Gagarin did in 1961. Okay, in the 60s, NASA put human beings and a spacecraft on the moon. Okay, to like be celebrating that 50 some years later, our richest person can manage to go fly against the edge of space for a few minutes is outrageously stupid. And it just goes to demonstrate that innovation is not tied to capitalism or to wealth or to success. If we were to be funding NASA, you guys, this is part of what is so frustrating about this whole story, is that when Bezos wants a government contract, he has no problem getting it. When Bezos loses out on a government contract, the Senate is immediately willing to just give him a handout, right? But when NASA requests funding to levels that, by the way, are a lot lower than what Jeff Bezos received, they're denied. So, in other words, Congress is more apt to supply a billionaire with money that they don't need than they are to invest in public good. And even if, like, I am all about space travel, I think it's important science. I think it's the next step in our species kind of growing up. Now, obviously, when I say next step, I mean way down the road, because we still have so much that we need to fix on our home planet right now. I'm not talking about like we're ready to go expand galactically or some nonsense. But I believe in that science and funding that science and working towards improving that science. And in part, the reason I do is because of how many other benefits come out of that. There are, like, I couldn't even begin to list the number of things that have nothing conceivably to do with space travel, but that you or I use in our daily lives, the technology of which was born out of NASA's work. So investing in this publicly is beneficial in so many different ways. And that, again, disproves this notion that we need billionaires or wealthy, successful people in order to have innovation in our society. Because when we publicly funded these space missions, we had all sorts of technological advancements coming out of it. So the issue I have is not necessarily like we can walk and chew gum, you guys. So I wouldn't have a problem with NASA being funded to go research this stuff and to improve our ability to invest in space travel. I'm all for that, so long as we're also implementing federal jobs guarantee and Medicare for all and a Green New Deal and housing reform and all this kind of stuff. So, like, they don't have to be like working against each other, but both we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But when you're just allowing the billionaires of your society to benefit from the technology that was born out of NASA 60 years ago, it seems pretty outrageous to me. And the media coverage of this, just to again kind of tie it back into that, was really, really, really ridiculous. I wish I would have queued this clip up, but I don't know how many of you saw this. I want to say it was Fox News, but I'm not totally sure. One of the mainstream outlets had somebody on, and this guy said, to see Jeff Bezos so excited after his space flight, you know what that is? He literally said this. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not making this up. I swear to God. He said, that's one less black kid who's going to go engage in crime. He's basically saying somewhere there's some black kid that's going to be inspired by this. Well, first of all, what a bigoted assumption. Like the idea that every black kid is going to go engage in crime if they don't see Jeff Bezos go to the edge of space. What a ludicrous notion on the surface. What a bigoted assumption to make. What a xenophobic perspective to have on the black community. But also, like, why is that the only thing that you think can inspire people? What if NASA did it? Like, why don't we fund NASA? I just, The idea that that kid wouldn't be inspired by art or wouldn't be inspired by, fill in the blank, maybe being involved in politics or journalism or activism. The idea that that kid wouldn't be inspired maybe by sports or whatever his hobby or passion is. The idea that like you need Jeff Bezos to go fly against the edge of space to inspire kids not to be criminals. I mean, that's a reach of gargantuan proportions. I cannot even begin to describe how ludicrous and incoherent and ridiculous that is. But that's what they were saying on fucking cable news. Mainstream press was just absolutely creaming themselves over Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson's flights when they were, again, just repeating what we did 60 years ago. I can't underscore that enough, you guys. We act like this was some historical innovation or some, moment of turning a page on technology in human history or something like that. No, NASA's done far more incredible things, and they did them decades and decades ago. Okay. So just really want to hammer home how insane all of the narratives around all of that stuff, truly are. It's nothing to celebrate. It's not even really newsworthy, but and especially it's not newsworthy when all of the things going on in this country are currently going on, right? Like we have so many conflicts going on around the world, so many injustices happening around the world. We're still in COVID. In fact, we're seeing a spike here in COVID, right? The infrastructure negotiations are going on, and like there's all these other things that the media could be focusing on and would at least have a somewhat legitimate reason to be focusing on, like in terms of newsworthiness. And instead, what are they doing? They're talking about the billionaire space race. You just can't make this shit up. It's beyond ridiculous. Beyond ridiculous. So I also have another story here about Biden's neglecting to move forward with any form of progressive agenda. And this is actually about marijuana. So this is a no-brainer issue across political lines all over the country. Very few people oppose legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana. And to Chuck Schumer's credit, I mean, I'm usually out here slamming Chuck Schumer, but I will give him credit on this particular bill. He's proposed a pretty robust marijuana legalization bill. It would not just legalize weed, but it would attempt to sort of funnel the benefits of that legalization to the communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs. So that's a critical part of these policy discussions, is that we not only need to change our policy about the substance itself, but we need to make sure that we're not just allowing the rich white business community to come in and start profiting off of this stuff when it's been the impoverished Black and Indigenous communities that have been most victimized by the laws to start with. How fair is it to have a multimillionaire owning pot shops and making good money on those pot shops while there's still a bunch of people, disproportionately Black and poor people, sitting in jail cells because they possessed or sold weed? How fair is that? It's not. It's ridiculous. It's unjust. So I will say to Chuck Schumer's credit on this one, he's pushing for a rather robust version of marijuana legalization. So this is in CNBC. Schumer proposes federal legislation to decriminalize marijuana. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer proposed legislation Wednesday to legalize marijuana at the federal level, a move aimed at easing restrictive drug policies that have disproportionately impacted communities of color and the poor. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and introduce regulations to tax cannabis products. The proposal would expunge federal records for nonviolent cannabis offenders and allow people serving time in federal prison for nonviolent marijuana crimes to petition a court for resentencing. That's not quite as like, I'd rather them just be out, but that's at least some mechanism to try to address the people who are currently unjustly sitting in jail or prison for this. Quote, "This is monumental. At long last, we are taking steps in the Senate to right the wrongs of a failed war on drugs," Schumer, Democrat, New York, said during a press conference at the Capitol. Schumer unveiled the draft along with Senate Finance Committee Chair Ron Wyden from Oregon and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. So why am I bringing this up? Well, the other aspect of this, unfortunately, is that Chuck was asked about Biden's position, about the White House's position, and he basically said, well, his position hasn't changed. Okay, Joe opposes legalizing weed. Joe wrote the crime bill. Joe has long been not just a supporter of, but a leader of creating the war on drugs. And so it looks like this bill would probably not have any chance of passing in the near future. And it's not just Biden either. This would have to go through regular order, which means it would need 60 votes in the Senate. You're not going to get it. You're just not. Even though Republican voters are not so opposed to legalizing weed, the Republican Party at the congressional level very much is. And quite frankly, I don't even know if you can get every Democrat on board with this bill. And again, that's despite the fact that the Democratic Party overwhelmingly supports legalizing weed. But I think a Manchin or a Sinema or a Tester or any of these other conservative Democrats might be inclined not to support that. So they may even struggle to get to 50, let alone to try to get to 60 to get 10 Republicans on board. And then, even if that happens, Joe Biden is apparently holding firm with his position that he does not support legalization. So really unfortunate stuff, you guys. Like this one's a no-brainer. It's so obvious. It would be so easy to do. And with all of the talk over the last year or two about Black Lives Matter, about George Floyd, about Breonna Taylor, and all these other names, all these other people who were brutalized or killed or murdered by police, for all the talks about injustices in our legal and criminal systems, there's been almost nothing done about it. Even the Obama era reforms, you guys did absolutely nothing. We did not see a decrease in police violence or murders. We just didn't. In fact, Minneapolis PD was one of the first departments to essentially take all of the suggestions from Obama's reforms. They implemented all of them. And then what happened? They not only killed George Floyd, I get all the names mixed up, but there was a couple of others that they killed while the George Floyd protests and trials were going on. So it's unfortunate that even when this issue is front and center, even when protesters are making a lot of noise about this, even when it gets to the point that it's kind of one of the primary stories in the country, we still can't really move the needle on the powers that be. So it's sad to see. And I also just last thing that I want to note, I know I gave Chuck credit for this bill. I do want to note that I don't think he's doing it out of the good of his heart or some sort of principle. Chuck Schumer is terrified that he's going to be primaried by one of the prominent progressives in New York State, and he is up in 2022. So right now, this is exactly when he would pretend to be progressive so as to try to fend off a primary challenger. A lot of rumors about AOC potentially primarying him. I don't know that that's going to happen. She's only on her second term in Congress, but I think Chuck is terrified of that. I think that's what this is, because quite frankly, AOC could beat him. She's very rapidly become one of the most popular politicians in New York State. So I think that's really what's at the root of his pushing this bill last minute. And Chuck knows full well it's not going to pass. So he's not even taking any risk. He's basically just virtue signaling his position. But all of that being said, I supported Force the Vote for Medicare for All. And I support bringing these bills to the floor and pushing these bills, even if the intent is disingenuous. I think this does further the issue. When you put it front and center and you force the media to cover that Congress is considering this or voting on this, you can move the needle a little bit, right? And sometimes that pressure can mount up. If the issue really takes off, you actually might put enough pressure on Joe Biden to change his opinion. Now, again, I'm not saying this bill is going to pass. There's too many hurdles for this to pass in the next couple of years. We would need a different Congress, or we would need a substantially different social situation where there's a lot more pressure on these individuals. But I'm still in support of applying that pressure, even when I think it's not necessarily likely to work in the short term. So same reason, you know what? We were out marching for Medicare for All yesterday. Do I think today Joe Biden is going to write an executive? No, of course not. Do I think this year we're going to get Medicare for All? No, of course not. I'm not naive. I'm not stupid. But we need to keep that pressure up. There's value in keeping that pressure up. And I mean that both in an organizational way or an organizing way, an activism way, and also in a political sense with bills like this. So anyway, I'm obviously a staunch proponent of legalizing weed. I think the epitome of freedom is being able to control the state of your own consciousness without harming anybody else. And that is exactly what drug laws pertain to. And last point, I talked about this actually a little bit with Anthony Zankis, Professor Zankis, who I'm going to show another clip from our discussion here in today's stream. And I think that this part of the conversation was part of that discussion. He talked about addiction a little bit. He's a licensed clinical social worker and a professor. And he talked about addiction. And we went over a little bit how the history of drug laws in this country have nothing to do with, I think like a lot of people might just assume that, oh, like some scientists and health experts sat down in a room and figured out it would be better if they were illegal. No, that's not what happened. What happened was racism happened. Okay. The first laws against drugs in the United States were in the late 1800s, and they were against opium. Well, what really happened is that white families did not want their daughters hanging out with Chinese men. It was out and out anti-Chinese racism that led to those opium laws. We can go through the history coming up through the 60s with Nixon, when his aides later openly admitted they maintained the war on drugs because, quote, the blacks use heroin and the hippies smoke weed, and neither of them is voting for us. So if we can make it a felony for them to do that, then we can take them away from being part of the voting populace. So we can effectively take votes away from our opponent if we maintain these laws. We can oppress the communities that we don't want to achieve power because they oppose us politically and socially. We can oppress them further if we maintain these laws. That was admitted openly by Nixon's administration. So I just want to point out the drug laws are not born out of science or out of health expertise. If they were, we would have the exact opposite situation. If you talk to actual behavioral health experts, if you talk to medical doctors, you'll get a very different result than if you talk to conservative politicians who are invested in maintaining their power, right? So anyhow, I wanted to talk a little bit. This kind of pertains to the Cuba situation. Ron DeSantis is the governor in Florida, and he, when the Black Lives Matter protests started, he was very opposed to that movement, and he created what I think is probably an unconstitutional law, but he created it nonetheless. It's a very strict law against demonstrations and protests, right? And it was clearly designed to crack down on Black Lives Matter protesters. Well, DeSantis has also been very vocal about his opposition to the Cuban government, and he has taken this opportunity of the unrest and protests in Cuba to espouse those opinions. Well, funny enough, when conservative protesters opposing the Cuban government took to the streets, DeSantis decided not to implement those very strict laws that he had implemented against protesters, which he insisted at the time had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. No, this is about law and order. This is about maintaining civility, just not when I agree with the cause, right? So this is in the Miami Herald. DeSantis's anti-riot law didn't apply as Cuba protesters shut down a Miami-Dade road. Yeah. Gee, I wonder. Governor DeSantis should have just laid it on the line when a reporter asked about the scores of Cuban-American demonstrators and their supporters who shut down a portion of the Palmetto Expressway in Miami-Dade County. Instead, he deflected, talking about protesters in Cuba. Implicit in the question, however, was whether the governor's vaunted anti-riot law created in the wake of George Floyd demonstrations would apply in the case of the demonstrators blocking streets in an expressway in Miami-Dade. Their cause is righteous, of course, bringing down Cuba's oppressive and regressive regime. Florida's misbegotten anti-riot law leaves even peaceful demonstrators subject to being arrested if a protest is arbitrarily deemed a riot. The law explicitly makes blocking a highway a felony offense. Worse, it gives civil legal immunity to people who drive through protesters who are blocking a road, basically encouraging haters to do just that. You guys, he legalized vehicular homicide if you arbitrarily deem protesters to be rioters. That should be beyond anybody's pale. That should make your blood boil. That is the antithesis of freedom of expression. That is one of the most brazen constitutional violations that I have seen in my entire life. So for that hypocrisy not to be noted, for that hypocrisy not to be acknowledged, is just, you know, an indication of how much the culture war has kind of got a stranglehold on our politics, because people engage in this as though it's a sporting event, as though it's my team, your team. Instead of engaging in it in a principled way. I'd like to apply the Chomsky rule to this, and I know that usually is used in a foreign policy context, but Chomsky basically says if you flip the players and maintain the situation and you have a different opinion, you're a hypocrite. You're not being principled. Well, DeSantis is a hypocrite because as soon as you flip the players and he agrees with the protesters instead of opposing them, his position completely changes. So I want to bring you guys here. It looks like a rather long video. We'll see what this is. I have to confess, oh, looks like we're having trouble playing that one. I apologize, you guys. We're going to try to bring you coverage of this protest as best as we possibly can. We've had a little bit of technological issues here, and I don't have anybody communicating with them on the ground like I did yesterday. And, so I do sincerely apologize if there's any interruptions to the stream as I try to bring you those clips. I want to show you guys a couple of clips here about the Biden administration's position on Facebook and social media. I want to preface this, okay? I am absolutely not anti-vax. I encourage everybody to get the vaccine. I got 2 shots of the Pfizer months ago, and I feel great, okay? I'm not at all trying to platform or further the anti-vax narratives. I want to have a discussion about how the administration is treating social media giants. And their objection to Facebook is effectively that there were a dozen or so, or the most prominent, there was about a dozen of people who were posting anti-vax stuff on Facebook. And it is misinformation. It's misinformation. There's a level of distrust that is very reasonable. There's a level of skepticism that is very reasonable when a new vaccine or a new drug comes out. I'll say it again, you guys, I don't trust Pfizer or Moderna as far as I can throw them. I don't trust the CDC or the FDA as far as I can throw them. All of the revolving door corruption that goes on makes it very difficult to trust these regulatory institutions, which are supposed to make it so that when a new drug comes out, we know whether or not we can trust it, right? I have no trust in them. So this isn't me trying to convince you that your distrust is misplaced. But how we handle that kind of misinformation online is actually a very important issue. It's a very important issue. And it gets into what these platforms should be defined as and treated as and what role they should have in our society. I think the internet should be a public utility. The whole internet should be a public utility and should be regulated as such, instead of having giant corporate entities who get to decide what is and is not true, or what is and is not misinformation, or what have you. Just to make a comparison before we watch these clips. Imagine if you guys remember when the lab leak theory was you were deemed to be a conspiratorial Trump nut if you even acknowledged it was a possibility. Well, now it's looking more and more likely. There's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence that that's exactly what happened. I want to be clear again. I am not saying that the Chinese government released a bioweapon or some sort of crazy, I'm not going down that path at all. I think gain of function research may have led to a lab leak, and we know lab leaks are not terribly uncommon. So anyway, my point is, in bringing all of that up, months ago, Facebook may have deemed you a conspiratorial nut who's spreading misinformation if you dared to even question the narrative that this was of natural origins. And yet now, as information has come out, that's a very reasonable position to take, and very serious people are taking that position. So this is a dangerous, dangerous road to go down, to allow Google or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or any of these giant corporate entities to determine what is and is not fact, what is and is not true, what is and is not acceptable discourse, is a dangerous game to play. Okay. So I have 2 clips here for you guys. The first one is Biden on Facebook, and the second one is going to be Jen Psaki on Facebook. We're going to watch these clips and then discuss.
I had just read that on the Facebook pointed out that Facebook, of all the misinformation, 60% of the misinformation came from 12 individuals. That's what the article said. So I was asked that question about what do I think is happening. Facebook isn't killing people. These 12 people are out there giving misinformation. Anyone listening to it is getting hurt by it. It's killing people. It's bad information. My hope is that Facebook, instead of taking it personally that somehow I'm saying Facebook is killing people, that they would do something about the misinformation, the outrageous misinformation about the vaccine. That's what I meant.
Have they done enough, in your opinion, to stop?
I haven't, to be completely honest with you, I don't know if they did anything today. Up to over the weekend, I don't think they had, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Will you hold them accountable if they don't do more to stop the spread?
When you say hold accountable, I just want to, I'm not trying to hold people, I'm trying to make people to look at themselves, look in the mirror. Think about that misinformation going to your son, your daughter, your relative, someone you love. That's what I'm asking.
So, you know, he did try to walk back his statement a little bit there, but at the same time, he's saying at the end, like, I'm not trying to hold them accountable. I'm trying to get them to look in the mirror. Well, Joe, you're the president of the United States. When you comment on something like this, you're using the bully pulpit. So just own that. Just say, here's what I want them to do, right? But he knows if he comes out and says that, he's going to get a lot of pushback from free speech activists. He knows he can't just openly oppose freedom of expression. You guys, there's ugly sides that come with free speech. We have to accept it's a two-lane street. You get to lie. You get to be nasty. Those are not criminal acts in a free society. So, you know, it's worth noting that he's attempting to walk a line where he doesn't appear to be opposing free speech, but he also is trying to sort of force Facebook to crack down on that free speech in their own way, right? And this is part of why I think that the internet needs to be a public utility. I'm not at all supporting what those dozen people are posting. It's misinformation, and if I saw it, I would comment and say, that's misinformation. You're wrong. Here's some information, okay? But that's entirely different than my saying they shouldn't be allowed to post it, okay? And I know we get into some tricky stuff here with public health crises, you guys. It's not just a disagreement about pineapple on pizza, okay? I really do understand that. But it's been shown that when you crack down on this stuff, it's not limited to that issue, right? When, for example, when Reddit removed Donald Trump's page, okay, or subreddit, they also removed Chapo Trap House's subreddit, because they have to appear even or neutral. So it's just worth noting that he's really trying to walk a line there that in reality is not how these crackdowns actually end up happening. This next one is Jen Psaki, who got into a bit of a spat with Ducey of Fox News. Let's watch this interaction and then come back and discuss.
Thanks, Jen. First on COVID origins, is the White House worried that China continues stonewalling the World Health Organization investigators and now is saying things like they think maybe COVID-19 got into China through frozen food?
We are certainly continue to be concerned, Peter, about misinformation coming from voices in China about certainly the origins, their lack of participation in the process, their lack of willingness to provide data and information to the World Health Organization. As you know, we are undergoing our own process here, our 90-day review here, but certainly the Chinese providing information, being a participant in the process, would aid the effort.
And then speaking of misinformation and the announcement from yesterday, for how long has the administration been spying on people's Facebook profiles looking for vaccine misinformation?
Well, that was quite a loaded and inaccurate question, which I would refute.
How?
Well, Peter, first of all, as you know, we're in a regular touch with a range of media outlets. Let me finish. As we are in regular touch with social media platforms. This is publicly open information, people sharing information online, just as you are all reporting information on your news stations.
But, okay, so these 12 people who you have on a list, 12 individuals, do they know that somebody at the Surgeon General's office is going through their profile?
I'm happy to get you the citation of where that comes from. There's no secret list. I will tell you that these are people who are sharing information on public platforms on Facebook, information that is traveling, is inaccurate. Our biggest concern here, and I frankly think it should be your biggest concern, is the number of people who are dying around the country because they're getting misinformation that is leading them to not take a vaccine. Young people, old people, kids, children. This is all a lot of them are being impacted by misinformation.
The big concern, though, I think, for a lot of people on Facebook is that now this is Big Brother watching you.
They're more concerned about that than people dying across the country because of a pandemic where misinformation is traveling on social media platforms. That feels unlikely to me. If you have the data to back that up, I'm happy to discuss
and
it.
About things that are on Facebook, I looked this morning. There are videos of Dr. Fauci from 2020 before anybody had a vaccine, and he is out there saying there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. So is the administration going to contact Facebook and ask them to take that down?
Well, first, I think what Dr. Fauci has said himself, who's been quite public out there, is that science evolves, information evolves, and we make that available in a public way to the American people.
Exactly.
I have never seen any data to suggest that that the vaccines cause infertility. That is information that is irresponsibly traveling. Okay,
just one more. Sorry, excuse me, just one more. Okay, about the science evolving. Facebook used to block people from posting that COVID may have originated for a lab. That is something this president now admits is a possibility. So, is there any concern that things you are trying to block or have taken down might someday turn out to be?
We don't take anything down. We don't block anything. Facebook and any private sector company makes decisions about what information should be on their platform. Our point is that there is information that is leading to people not taking the vaccine, and people are dying as a result. And we have a responsibility as a public health matter to raise that issue. The responsibility we all have, the government, media, platforms, public messengers, to give accurate information. Go ahead.
So interesting interaction there. Peter Doocy and Jen Psaki have gone back and forth a plethora of times since she has been the press secretary. Personally, I cannot stand either of them, but that's just my own view. I think it's just worth having this discussion, you guys. It's you create issues when you empower these social media giants to the degree that we have. You create issues when you allow a corporate entity like Google or Verizon to have such power over people's access to the internet. So then when we get into public health crises or national security issues where the government has more of an excuse to crack down, there aren't as many avenues for free speech activists to go through. If this was a public utility, you could legitimately argue that like it's a constitutional violation to remove speech from a public space, right? Because like if I'm walking down the street, as long as I'm not inciting violence or like yelling fire in a theater is obviously the classic example. As long as I'm not inciting, an instance like that, I can pretty much say whatever I want. I can walk by everyone on the street and say, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, right? I'm allowed to do that. I'm allowed to be nasty, right? I can also walk down the streets and spew vaccine misinformation, and you cannot throw me in jail for that. And you should not be able to throw me in jail for that, okay? Now, again, we all should be the person that stops on the street and calls that misinformation out, okay? But that's a different discussion. So I just wanted to show this sort of back and forth that is developing between the Biden administration, the White House, and these social media giants who have such a stranglehold over our narratives. And, make sure that people are fighting for making the internet a public utility, as opposed to allowing the corporate overlords to determine what is and is not acceptable narrative, what is and is not true, what is and is not misinformation. Let's talk a little bit about Haiti. This is, I've covered a couple of times what a crazy story this is. Want to compare it again to Cuba, where those demonstrations are happening in D.C. In opposition to our embargo. With Cuba, you see endless talk from the corporate press about these protests, and you hear endless hand-wringing about the Cuban government. In Haiti, I really want to drive home. Jovenel Moïse was a U.S.-backed president who had overstayed his term, so he was not democratically there. He was an authoritarian of sorts, right? Holding on to his seat despite that not being a democratic institution that put him there. U.S. continued to support him. He was rewriting the Constitution. There are at least two, and I've even heard some people say 3 versions of their Constitution in Haiti, which leads to deep confusion when the president is no longer fit to serve. Because they have contradictory instructions as to who takes over or what happens, and making it even more complicated. In one of those constitutions, the Chief Justice would have taken over for the president. The Chief Justice died a little over a month ago from COVID. Okay, so now we have an update here. Claude Joseph was the prime minister, and Jovenel Moïse, right before his assassination, had replaced Claude Joseph with Ariel Henry. And Ariel Henry was set to take the prime minister position the week after Moïse was assassinated. So Claude Joseph stayed in his seat and assumed power when Moïse was no longer able to serve, obviously, because he's dead. And the United States has now come in and gotten themselves involved behind the scenes. So I have a piece here in the New York Times. Haiti, urged by foreign powers, announces new government. Claude Joseph was the country's leader in the aftermath of President Jovenel Moïse's assassination. He will hand power to Ariel Henry and join a new unity government intended to keep Haiti stable. Port-au-Prince, with foreign powers weighing in, Haitian officials announced a new prime minister on Monday in an attempt to resolve a caustic leadership struggle in the wake of President Jovenel Moïse's assassination. Claude Joseph, the prime minister who took control of Haiti's government immediately after the killing, said he was stepping down in favor of Ariel Henry, a neurosurgeon who had been appointed to the position by the president shortly before he was killed. Quote, "I'm a courageous man. I took charge and I spoke to the population and said, keep calm. We need to behave intelligently," Mr. Joseph said in an interview, speaking of the role he played after the president's death. "Otherwise, no one knows what would have happened." Ever since the assassination on July 7th, Haitian politicians have been at loggerheads grappling for control of the government. The scramble for power is being heavily influenced, even directed, some Haitians say, by foreign countries, including the United States, which has held enormous sway in Haiti since invading the country more than 100 years ago. Haiti has become a baseball being thrown between foreign diplomats, Joseph Lambert, the president of Haiti's Senate, said in an interview, adding that pressure from American diplomats was a major factor in the reshuffling of Haiti's leadership. So America getting involved here and maintaining the same position that we've long had in Haiti, right? Ariel Henry was set to take over and Moïse had selected him. Moïse was the US-backed leader. So we're maintaining the position that we had previously had, that is in support of an authoritarian who had taken this seat, overstayed his term, was rewriting the Constitution, also had disallowed elections, you guys. So they're talking about the head of the Senate there. The Senate is supposed to have 30 or 30-something individuals. Apologies if I don't have that number exactly right. I think it's 30. They only have 10 senators right now. The House has barely any members, if any members, because they hadn't done elections. So Moïse was an authoritarian who was taking control of the country for himself and disallowing democratic powers to replace him. And now it looks like that same regime will be continued, because he would not have selected Ariel Henry to replace Claude Joseph if Henry was not going to be in line with his positions and in line with him maintaining his power, right? You don't appoint somebody to prime minister if you think they're going to oppose you and your positions. So the United States, while we hand-wring about Cuba, right? While we hand-wring about Russia meddling in elections, we're now going to go to Haiti, where we have had, major influence over their political process and behind the scenes with intelligence and all this kind of stuff for over a century. And we're going to continue meddling there. What do you hear from the mainstream media about this? They just plug their ears. La, 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 la. I hear nothing, right? So, hypocrisy of our foreign policy on full display. And a continued oppression of a country that, as I've spoken about before, has a rather inspirational history. The only slave rebellion to be successful in history, as far as I know, was in Haiti. They actually overthrew Napoleon's rule. You guys, they beat Napoleon. A slave uprising beat Napoleon. Okay? And then the French did all this really horrendous stuff where they basically said, you have to pay us for all of the slaves, the property that you have freed. Also just colonial bullshit. But it's sad to see a country that has that kind of inspirational and motivational history falling victim once again to the US's oppression, the US's hypocritical foreign policy. So at this point, you guys, I'd like to show you another portion of the interview I did, the discussion I had with Professor Anthony Zankis. He is a licensed clinical social worker in New York. He teaches at Columbia and Adelphi, and he's got some insights into how our health system neglects people. He's got some fantastic political insights as well. He's a political activist. He fights for income equality. He fights to move us towards a place where we're combating climate change. He talks about racial discrepancies in healthcare and in other social services. This portion of the conversation, we were talking a little bit about addiction and how our society sort of creates an environment where addiction is a real problem when it doesn't need to be, as well as a couple of other issues. So enjoy Professor Zankis here. He's quite insightful on the issue of substance abuse, and we'll come back and discuss.
How about this? We create environments that don't ruin people's health. What if
you can't blame an individual for responding to the situation that they're in and trying to be more fulfilled or happy, right? That's not an individual problem. That's a systemic and societal problem that individual is having to turn to things that are, like you say, if done regularly, pretty unhealthy and damaging to your health.
They did a study years ago with rats, and they put rats in cages, and they had a water bottle, sugar water, right? So they would drink the sugar water with glucose, and then they would put another water bottle that had sugar in it, but it also had like either opioids or cocaine in it. And they found that the rat in the cage would do the drug water over and over and over until it became addicted. Many of them overdosed and died. They became addicted. Almost all of them did. And they said, look, when you have access, because rats are like people, pretty much so, when we have access to these addictive substances, we're just going to do them until we get sick and die. And then a bunch of Canadian scientists, thank you Canadians, and looked at it and said this was a flawed experiment. And the flaw was rats are social animals. They are not meant to be isolated. In fact, when you isolate a rat, just like when you isolate a person, they become chronically stressed. So they decided to design something called Rat Park. And in Rat Park, what they did was they created this beautiful area for the rats to be in. And instead of a little cage with nothing to do, because the rat had nothing to do but the drugs. They didn't have a little wheel to run on. They had nothing. And they were alone and they were stressed. Now they were in this big area with lots of other rats to play with. They could have rat sex and make rat babies, and the families could cuddle together at night for warmth. They could play on the wheels. And it was beautiful. And at the end of Rat Park was a little sugar water bottle that had drugs in it, opioids or cocaine. Many tried it once. Very few tried it more than once. None of them became addicted, and none of them died. So, there's a guy, Johan Hari, who's written about this, and he said, it's not the drug, it's your cage. So right now, America has pushed us into this hyper-competitive, individualistic life where we don't have meaningful connections with other people in our neighborhoods or communities. We're exhausted from working so many hours. We can't even spend quality time with our families or have good solitude with ourselves or spend time in prayer if that's your thing. And it's all about making money, and on top of that, you can't afford health care. What does that do to us? It beats us down. And then we become the rat in the cage, and the government, what do? They arrest you.
Yeah.
They arrest you for using drugs. Like it's insane. Side note, if you dial our timeline back to the 1990s, there were quite a few senators and Congress members who did plenty of cocaine. So just talk to people who worked on the Hill back then. And some of them are in very high offices today.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of have this idea of what a junkie is, and what we're basically doing is exhibiting classism because we're picturing the poor addict when we think of junkie, right? But name me a profession that does more cocaine than Wall Street bankers. I mean, come on. They're like, and do they ever get in trouble for it, right? So they're like, there's definitely a classist element to that as well. And if you look at the history of drug laws in this country, it was actually born out of racism. The first drug laws were anti-opium laws that were a bunch of white families that didn't want their daughters hanging out with Chinese men. I mean, it was out and out racism. And you can carry that through with, Nixon's aides admitting openly we wanted to keep heroin illegal because the blacks use heroin and weed illegal because the hippies smoke weed, and neither of them is voting for us. That was their reasoning for maintaining these laws. So it's really not about health or well-being or science or any sort of, what I mean? Yeah, it's out and out racism and oppression.
I mean, listen, the president's son is a crack addict.
Yeah. And notice he's very compassionate. He takes the right approach there where he's like, he deserves a second chance. It was a mistake, right? But with everyone else, go in the cage.
Well, he's a crack addict that got $80,000 a month from a Ukrainian oil energy company, and he had no background in energy. So, like, yeah, I mean, it's easier to get off of drugs if you have those kinds of opportunities. Portugal does a really nice job. Instead of arresting, they've decriminalized all drugs, heroin, crack, crystal meth, everything. So instead of arresting you, the police give you a card and say, listen, your community cares about you. We don't want you to get sick and we don't want you to die. Here's a card. If you want to talk to a case manager, you can call this card. If you want us to bring you there now, we can. Otherwise, we hope you're safe. That's what the police in Portugal do. And then what do? Instead of putting money into prosecution, they give the people loans so they can start their own business. Like, that's the kind of thing we could do this. We have the money.
Okay, that's a perfect transition to what I wanted to ask you next, right? So we're advocates of MMT and a federal job guarantee at Real Progressives. And one of the things a federal job guarantee does is it would allow us to employ people for work that is not very profitable for the private industry. So in your line of work, in social work, can you talk about how beneficial it would be to be able to add workers to social, in all forms? You're talking about addiction, you talk about victims of violence and the help that they need. I mean, how much could we expand our ability to help people in these ways if we had a federal job guarantee that could provide these services?
Well, the first thing, what it would do for people is not just give them money, which they need. It makes people feel needed and useful. And people need to feel connected and valued by their communities. People who don't feel connected and valued by their communities wither spiritually, physically. Right? It's a terrible thing to feel like you're not needed anymore. Right? So, the jobless don't just deal with financial struggles. They deal with the spiritual struggle of not feeling like they fit in. And that's not a good feeling. This is where deaths of despair come from, suicide, overdoses. Right? We know about this. But in my field, gosh, if we could benefit so much from having the help we need to do the work we want to do. We're always struggling, nonprofits, to do this good work of helping and assisting people in the community who have mental illness, victims of domestic violence, homelessness, all those things. And if we could have more people helping us with that, that would be surely a wonderful thing. And at the same time, you're employing people and giving them hope. And it connects people with their communities. And that's what we need to do. But I fear that the government knows this and doesn't want it to happen because they fear us coalescing, getting together, and they fear democracy. When we really come together and want to make change, we can do it. And the people in power don't want it. It's a lot about self-interest. To them, the fact that they're doing well and we're not actually means something to them. It's kind of sick. That's why I say it's sociopathic.
Well, and that's wealth is relative, right? So for there to be a billionaire, there has to be tens of thousands of poor people, like by definition, or else that billion wouldn't be worth what it is. If we all had $1 million, then being a multimillionaire wouldn't be such a big deal, but we don't. So it is. It's all relative, right? So that's a really, really fascinating point. I also wanted to ask you about, you've talked quite a bit about the climate crisis, and this is kind of, I think this ties into healthcare quite nicely, because a lot of people end up more sick because they're in a bad environment. They don't have clean air to breathe. Their water is polluted by an oil company or a chemical company or what have you, energy companies, these kinds of things. And that also plays into the stress, right? My generation, I'm a millennial. I've seen a lot of studies on this where we're actually worried about our future in terms of having a sustainable planet, which adds to our stress levels, and all of this stuff just starts to work towards that beat down that you were talking about. So can you talk a little bit about how all of these various policies contribute to a healthier society, things like cleaning up the environment and providing a job and economic stability to people, how it all works together to create a healthier society?
Well, I feel like you're already starting to do a great job of that yourself. So yeah, it does connect. So let's dial back just a little bit. Some years ago, I was chosen by former Vice President Al Gore to be part of his climate reality project. So I was in the first class of 200 that was trained back in like 2007. So it's like 13, 14 years ago. And I got trained by him twice. And I've met him and spoken with Vice President Gore. He's an interesting man. He's a smart man. And, we were looking at that climate issue. He's been talking about it for decades. He's not the only one. Scientists have been talking about it for 50 years or more. But, that climate reality project started 14 years ago. And sadly, we're in a worse place now than we were then. Because at that point, the number of parts per billion of carbon in the atmosphere was below 400. Now it's above 400, right? And what does that mean for us? Here's the deal. Whenever there's a catastrophic event or condition that's going on in society, it is the most vulnerable, the poor, who are most likely to suffer. Here's an example, fracking. So fracking contributes to climate catastrophe. It's a terrible program. They should stop fracking. Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris doubled down on fracking during the debates when they were running, and then since taking office, they pushed fracking, pushed it. It's terrible for the climate. But in the short term, it's also terrible for poor communities because they're not fracking in Beverly Hills, okay? They're not fracking in the richest communities of Westchester, New York. They're doing it in poor areas in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And those chemicals that they use to hydraulically frack the energy out of the rocks are toxic and poison the water. And what's happening is poor people living in a fairly large radius of where they do fracking get cancer and die. That's a short-term effect of, yes, climate change is terrible when we talk about rising sea levels and all those things, but we don't have to go 10 years in the future for that. We can look at what's happening right now. Our environmental policies and energy policies are literally an attack, a war on Black America and poor America. And by the way, this is perpetrated by the Democrats, right? So is it a stretch to say that the Democratic Party's policies are killing Black Americans and poor Americans? No, that's exactly what's happening. And it's also not a stretch to say, and they don't give a shit because they've decided this is how we're going to do it. And they'll say, like, we're going back into the Paris Climate Accords. Paris Climate Accords are completely inadequate.
Yep.
So yes, we shouldn't have left them, which is what Trump did because he's an idiot.
Yeah.
However, going back wasn't adequate in the first place. It's weird with climate because unlike COVID, we won't get too much into that because a full shutdown in this country would have put us at zero COVID within 3 months. That's all we had to do. But, capitalism, we didn't want to do it. Everybody get vaxxed. Well, guess what? That's going to take months to happen. It's good to have the vaccine, but not everybody's going to get it the same day, and we still have suffering going on. I lost a family member to COVID, and it was horrible. So, but with the climate crisis, there's no mystery. We know exactly how to solve it. It's not like a great meteor coming toward Earth. Well, what do we do? call Morgan Freeman or whoever, you know, like I get you right. But no, this is something that's complete. He was in that movie, right? Am I wrong there?
Yeah, I know. I caught the reference. Yeah.
I mix up my movies sometimes. But we know exactly what to do about the climate crisis. We are putting off. You know, the United States government, run by psychopaths and sociopaths, which I have publicly said, and I stand behind that comment. I'm not being hyperbolic. The United States government, run by psychopaths and sociopaths, is the 6th grade kid putting off their science project till the last minute. And they're going to fail.
I love that line. He had a few really great lines in that discussion. They're the 6th grade science student who's putting off their project and they're going to fail. Great job there from Professor Zankus, and thank him for taking the time to do that interview. I hope to have him on again sometime soon. Quick update, you guys, on the situation in DC pertaining to the protest in Cuba. I got word from John that they're having it's really bad internet coverage out there. I'm sure that has something to do with so many people being there. They're working on uploading the interview with Medea Benjamin, and I'm going to keep checking in, and I'm hoping I can bring you guys that shortly. Medea Benjamin is really fantastic, and I'm hoping we can hear what she has to say. If not, I'm sure that we will be able to provide that interview some other time. So we'll do our best here to bring it during the stream, and if not, keep your eye out for it to be posted at some other time, because, you know, definitely don't want to miss out on that. And good on everybody. Just quick shout out. Anybody who's participating in that protest or other protests. I saw that there was one in Seattle as well. I don't know if this was a nationwide thing or how many cities were involved, but shout out to anybody who's putting their feet on the ground to demand changes that are necessary, right? This is, I applaud everybody from yesterday's march. I applaud everybody who's participating in these kinds of anti-embargo protests as well. Also want to just run through some quick plugs here, you guys. realprogressives.org there at the bottom of the screen. If you want to learn more about us or support our organization, please go check us out at realprogressives.org. Lots of articles, lots of content, all sorts of stuff there. You know, it just really encourage everybody to get involved with our organization wherever you can. At Real Progress US, at RP_in_action. If you want to follow us on Twitter, I am at Luke Parcher Show. If you want to follow me on Twitter, also go subscribe to our YouTube channels. We have 2, Real Progress in Action and Real Progressives. A lot of people seem to only think we have one. Please go subscribe to both. We're also on Facebook. We're on Twitch. We're on Rockfin. Wherever you get your news, wherever you are involved in social media, please go follow us, support our work. Make sure you're not missing any of our fantastic content. So we have a story here about the parliamentarian and how the Democrats are effectively admitting that they're going to lean on the parliamentarian to refuse to do anything that is remotely liberal or progressive. They have this convenient excuse. We saw it with the $15 minimum wage, where if the parliamentarian says that it cannot be part of the reconciliation bill, then the Democrats can continue to claim that they support a policy that they're not actually willing to fight for. Just so everybody's aware, the parliamentarian is not an elected position. It is not actually an official. What it is an advisor to the Senate. There is the vice president in this, Kamala Harris, has veto power over the parliamentarian. Okay, in I want to say 2004, but it was during George W. Bush's presidency. Might have been a little earlier, in the early mid 2000s. George W. Bush simply fired the parliamentarian when he wouldn't do what the administration wanted, and they replaced him with somebody who would. Okay, that's what the Republicans did when the Bush tax cuts were at stake. So let's not act like an advisor to the Senate is any sort of institutional barrier to the policies that Joe Biden claims to support. He says he supports a $15 minimum wage. Well, then fucking do it, Joe. You had the ability to do it and you didn't. So it's like I can call myself a vegetarian all that I want while I shovel my mouth full of beef and chicken and lamb. But it's obviously not true, right? So that's what they're doing. They're playing this game where they hide behind an advisor who has no authority, no power whatsoever, has an excuse not to do the things that they know they have to claim to support, but don't actually support. So this is an article in Politico, their, what is it? Their daily newsletter thing, whatever it's called, Politico Playbook. Parliamentary games. A pair of stories up from CNN and Politico spotlight Democrats' upcoming gambit to backdoor immigration reform through the reconciliation process. Senate parliamentarian be damned. Quote, top Democrats with the support of the White House are planning to tuck a handful of immigration measures into their forthcoming $3.5 trillion spending bill. The tactic, which just months ago seemed like a long shot even to liberals, is now widely seen as President Joe Biden's best shot at confronting one of Washington's policy leviathans and delivering on a decades-long party promise, said Sarah Ferris. The most glaring obstacle here is the Senate rulebook. To pass muster, the immigration reforms would have to significantly impact the federal budget by generating revenue or deepening the deficit rather than merely being a side effect. Even raising the minimum wage failed to make the cut under that criterion early this year. Now, again, you guys, I want to note that is just the opinion of an advisor who has no authority. So the way Politico presents this as though like, well, that was deemed not to be the case. No. That was chosen by the Democrats and by Biden and Harris. They chose to allow that position to stand, that advisory position to dictate what actually happens, okay? Even raising the minimum wage failed to make... Oh, I'm sorry, did I already read that? Yes. CNN quotes former Senate parliamentarian Alan Fruman, who isn't buying it. Quote, I understand arguments are made that there are budgetary effects when you change immigration law, but I think there's probably a strong argument that those effects are secondary. Democrats' purpose is immigration policy. Democrats seem to think they win either way. Worst case, the parliamentarian rebuffs them, but at least they can tell the base they tried. Listen to that admission, you guys. They're admitting it's a win because we can say we tried when we didn't actually try. That should anybody who supports this party, sycophant is a sycophant. Like anybody who just blindly supports Democrats or really politicians in general. But in this case, the Democratic Party or Joe Biden or Senate leadership, any of those individuals, this should make you change your opinion. They're admitting we put on a theatrical performance for the voters when we know we need to, and the parliamentarian provides us an excuse to not act on the things that we promised we would act on, to not act on the policies that we said we would implement during the campaign that got us elected. Carrying on. But Republicans are prepared to pounce if they do. Senator John Cornyn, who's been involved in bipartisan immigration talks in the past, warned that Democrats will have to own it if they go down this road on a hot button issue, presumably meaning in the 2022 midterms. And what he means there is that immigration is a hot topic. It's a culture. It sparks a culture war. It throws gasoline on the culture war, right? So he means that if Democrats try to force this through reconciliation, we're going to endlessly batter them with that during the 2022 election cycle. Well, you know what? Democrats have long behaved out of fear and have long capitulated to and folded to and bent the knee for Republicans and refused to play hardball back. Just look at what happened with the Supreme Court over the last handful of years. At every single step, Republicans play hardball and Democrats go, oh, well, oh, if you must, right? But we're not going to do that because we want to be the good guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Republicans ruin a whole bunch of lives because we're the good guys. See how nice we are? See how civil we are, right? See how we follow norms and etiquette? It's beyond disgusting. And by the way, it plays right into the accurate portrayal of the party that they're a bunch of elite, wealthy snobs. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that the parliamentarian has no power, no authority, and is not in a position to make these decisions. What they're in a position to do is advise, and they can be overruled or fired in the case that they advise in a way that the ruling party does not approve of. And also, actually, you know what? Another side note on this, you guys. There's all this talk about filibuster reform and like, oh God, we can't reform the filibuster. There are like 160 some exceptions. I want to say it's at least 150. I think it's 160 plus exceptions to the filibuster. You know who put those exceptions in? Ruling parties put those exceptions in. When you control the Senate, you can change the rules, you guys. These are not like set in stone. The rules of the Senate, the way the Senate operates, are not a product of nature that somehow organically formed on Capitol Hill. These rules were written by people, by senators, and they can be unwritten or replaced or altered by senators. So the presentation from the mainstream press about this stuff is always that the Senate has to abide by this particular structure of rules when in reality, the Senate is constantly changing its own rules. Okay? We just saw Republicans do it to stack the Supreme Court. They removed the filibuster for Supreme Court justice votes, confirmation votes. They removed the filibuster process from that so that you only need 50. Why won't Democrats do that? The answer is very obvious. I say that like as though I'm surprised or angry, but the answer is very obvious because, again, just like the parliamentarian, it's a convenient excuse. Yeah, sure, we'd love to implement a $15 minimum wage. We'd love to, but no, can't do it. Filibuster, Republicans. And then when they're in charge and could undo the filibuster or change the filibuster rules, alter the way the Senate operates to their benefit, like Republicans do literally every fucking time they take power. What do the Democrats do in that situation? They roll over, they capitulate, they turn into the doormat that they really are. So I just really want to emphasize, you guys, don't let politicians hide behind the rules that they themselves write. Don't let them do it. Don't let them hide behind advisors who they control. Don't let them do it. It's outrageous. Imagine a CEO hiding behind their employee as it pertained to a decision that the company made. Like, well, my advisor said so, so I did it. So you can't blame me, blame my advisor. You know how insane that would come off? That's exactly what the Biden administration is doing. That's exactly what Chuck Schumer and Patty Murray and Dick Durbin and the rest of Democratic leadership in the Senate is doing. That's exactly what they're doing. Don't let them get away with it, at least not from an electoral perspective, right? Just outrageous in my view. We have another pretty remarkable story here, you guys. This is the Pegasus leak. I'm sure that many of you have seen some news about this or followed this. This is an article in Amnesty International. Massive data leak reveals Israeli NSO group spyware used to target activists, journalists, and political leaders globally. NSO, I don't know why I'm struggling. I keep wanting to say NSA. NSO group spyware has been used to facilitate human rights violations around the world on a massive scale, according to a major investigation into the leak of 50,000 phone numbers of potential surveillance targets. These include heads of state, activists, and journalists, including Jamal Khashoggi's family. Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist murdered by the Saudi crown prince. Quote, the Pegasus Project lays bare how NSO's spyware is a weapon of choice for repressive governments seeking to silence journalists, attack activists, and crush dissent, placing countless lives in peril. The Pegasus Project is a groundbreaking collaboration by more than 80 journalists from 17 media organizations in 10 countries, coordinated by Forbidden Stories, a Paris-based media nonprofit with the technical support of Amnesty International, who conducted cutting-edge forensic tests on mobile phones to identify traces of the spyware. Quote, the Pegasus Project lays bare how NSO's spyware is a weapon of choice for repressive governments. Oh, I just read that quote. I won't reread it again. Quote, these revelations blow apart any claims by NSO that such attacks are rare and down to rogue use of their technology. While the company claims its spyware is only used for legitimate criminal and terror investigations, it's clear its technology facilitates systemic abuse. They paint a picture of legitimacy while profiting from widespread human rights violations. Clearly, their actions pose larger questions about the wholesale lack of regulation that has created a wild west of rampant abuse targeting activists and journalists. Until this company and the industry as a whole can show it is capable of respecting human rights, there must be an immediate moratorium on the export, sale, transfer, and use of surveillance technology. So this is, the NSO group is a technology company from Israel, NSO, named after their founders. And their CEO, whose name I'm blanking on, came out and defended this, basically said, if there was a better way to do it, we would want to shut down what we're doing, but there's not, and someone has to do the dirty work. No. How about that? How about, no, you fucking don't. You do not have to violate people's constitutional rights. You do not have to spy on activists and journalists and other political leaders. How about that? What a crazy fucking concept, huh? Just ridiculous. The assumption, right? The base level assumption is like, well, we have to engage in all of this horrible behavior. This is the culture that we've created with our intelligence community. That, yes, we do horrible things, but this is the culture we've created in the Pentagon. Yes, we do horrible things, but, right, the assumption that we are always the good guy or that we are always a good faith actor, that if we do something wrong, it's a mistake. If someone else does something wrong, it's criminal. That perspective is what I mentioned earlier with the Chomsky rule. You're a hypocrite. If you buy into the American exceptionalism, you're a hypocrite. If you refuse to condemn America for what you will condemn other countries for, you're a hypocrite. And this is just another example of, like, imagine if Iran had used this technology and we found out that United States federal government leaders, like, I don't know, top secretaries of the Biden administration or top members of Congress or whatever, imagine they were on this list and some country like Iran or China or Venezuela or fill in the blank with some country we hate. Imagine if that country had used this technology to spy on one of our political leaders. Just imagine. We would consider that like an act of war. We'd probably go bomb somebody or implement further sanctions, right? That wreak havoc on civilians around the world. But what do we do when it's one of our allies that's the country that is housing the company creating the software, and when the targets of it are largely our own dissidents, like people that we oppose politically, activists that we oppose politically, and when I say we, I mean the US federal government. When that's the situation, well, then radio silence, crickets, nothing to say about that. That's fine. That's just the dirty work, right? Someone's got to do it. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. This leak is very important. A number of heads of state, you guys, Emmanuel Macron was probably the biggest name, French president, but a number of heads of state were part of this leak that they had tapped into Emmanuel Macron's cell phone, and a couple other presidents and prime ministers, and there was a king, I don't even remember who, but there was a king somewhere that they had hacked his cell phone. And this all came together because the journalists and activists allowed their phones to be investigated, and they found this software had infiltrated their phones. Another thing that's worth noting about this, that software does not require, like, there are a lot of times, you might get a text that says click on this link or something, and then when you click it, then your phone catches whatever virus or whatever. I'm not a techie guy, as you guys can tell, but the point is, with a lot of these schemes, you have to click the thing they send you in order for your phone to be infected. With this particular one, they just have to message you, which makes it significantly more dangerous, because none of us can stop somebody from texting us, right? We cannot click on the obviously suspicious link, but none of us can stop someone from texting us. You can't block a number you don't anticipate is going to text you. You can't, there's no way around that. So, it's incredibly dangerous, the kind of technology that we're seeing come to light that is utilized by bad faith actors in most cases, or by powerful governments and companies to crack down on activists and journalists. This is incredibly dangerous and is worth keeping an eye on going forward. And good on all of the people who brought that information to light, because it's entirely critical that we have this kind of information as a populace. And I just want to make a quick shout out here. I'm not going to get into this too much today, but shout out to Julian Assange and to everybody supporting Julian Assange, because it's the kind of journalism that WikiLeaks is doing, but that Julian Assange was doing before he was imprisoned. That's exactly the kind of journalism that brings these kinds of things to light, and that gives us a look at how our government is mistreating those that it views as opposing its political goals, mistreating those who want to stand up against the oppression that it levies on its constituents and constituents around the world. So, shout out to all the journalists doing that dangerous work. Jamal Khashoggi showed what consequence you can pay for being a political dissident and for reporting on powerful people in ways that they may not like. So it's dangerous work, and it's important work, and a huge shout out to all of those journalists, right? Hilarious story here. I like to keep it light every now and again, as much as I'm usually talking about how awful things in the world are. This is Candace Owens revealing that she knows almost nothing about politics, and that she's just spouting off for views and clicks. First one, she tweeted, "The COVID vaccine saves lives, which is why the government is making it free." She puts that in quotes, like that's what people are saying. K, so explain to me why insulin and asthma inhalers cost so much money. If the vaccines are really about the government trying to save your life, why do life-saving medicines cost so much? Good question, Candace. Why do they? Could that be because of the rapacious incentive structure that we've set up? Could that be because of capitalism? Could that be because of the corruption that goes on between big pharma and insurance industry and the regulatory agencies? Gee, Candace, could that be? Could it maybe be because we don't have a single payer system? Could it maybe be because we refuse to allow Medicare and Medicaid to negotiate for better drug prices? Could it be any of those things? Could it maybe be that we refuse to regulate big pharma and their price gouging schemes? Maybe that's the case. No, of course, to Candace, all of those things are good and worthy of support. So this is Candace accidentally endorsing single-payer healthcare. This is how little she understands about politics. And then hilariously, just a little while later, that was at 1:45 on the 20th. Now she comes out at 7:33, same day. It's 2021, and there are still grown adults who believe that there is such thing as free healthcare and free vaccines. They have entirely no concept of what taxes are and who pays for all the free stuff they demand. How is this possible? So I retweeted this and said, oops, I accidentally told the truth for a sec. Better come back with some economic illiteracy to cover my tracks. Because that's what that second tweet is. That's economic illiteracy. Taxes do not pay for federal spending. I don't know how many times I can say that, but it's just going to be deeply ingrained in my psyche to the point that I'm saying it in the middle of my sleep. Taxes do not fund spending, you guys. They don't. Spending has to happen first by definition. Before you have a dollar to pay your taxes with, it had to be spent into existence. The monopoly issuer of that dollar is the federal government. Every single dollar in your or my wallet or purse or bank account or stuffed under our bed or wherever the fuck you keep your money, every single dollar is by definition debt to the United States government. So to fearmonger about that is not just wrong, it's incoherent. It's to not understand how the monetary system works. It is illiterate. The saying I think I said on a previous live stream, 2 + 2 is 7. That's wrong. 2 + 2 is orange. That's what Candace just said. Totally illiterate, totally incoherent, not attached to reality, doesn't mean a thing. But she had to come back and say this because she realized she had accidentally endorsed a left-wing position. Really not even left-wing, I should take that back. A moderate position that is single-payer healthcare. 3/4 of the country supports it. It's moderate. It's not extreme. It's not left-wing. But she is the extremist who opposes it, right? The 25% who oppose it are extreme far-right maniacs, and that's Candace Owens. So when she realized she had accidentally endorsed a policy that she's supposed to oppose, she had to come back with the economic illiteracy to try to cover her tracks. This is the kind of quality content that you get on the right. I don't know why any sane human being would listen to these people, and maybe no sane human beings do. Let's one can only hope on that regard, right? Just insane. You would think that somebody with that kind of a following would at least be savvy about how they go about their messaging, or would at least like know how to portray their wrongness in a way that is not so obvious. And there are some who do that on the right, and I think they're quite dangerous. But Candace here just there's a reason that her people say, oh, we can't do Politicon. She's not ready for that. There's a reason that Candace Owens turned down a debate with Kyle Kulinski. It's because she would have gotten up on stage and said some fucking shit like that. And Kyle would have been like, did you just endorse single payer healthcare, dude? Like, hello? Anyway, there's a reason that she's actually not engaging in these discussions in a way that could reveal her lack of knowledge. So we have a couple more stories here. This is a really troubling one, and this is pertaining to the climate crisis, which I have been covering quite a bit lately as we have seen accelerating signs of its existence. This is in the Huffington Post. Record heat fuels unprecedented Siberian wildfires, melting permafrost. Climate change is mixing with neglect of fire safety rules, arson, and other factors to spur a nightmarish fire season in Russia. Thousands of wildfires engulf broad expanses of Russia each year, destroying forests and shrouding regions in acrid smoke. Northeastern Siberia has had particularly massive fires this summer amid record-setting heat. Many other regions across the vast country also have battled wildfires. Some factors behind Russia's endemic wildfires and their consequences, the record heat is the top one. In recent years, Russia has recorded high temperatures that many scientists regard as a clear result of climate change. The hot weather has caused permafrost to melt and fueled a growing number of fires. So this is of particular concern, you guys. Siberia is of particular concern in a number of ways. And I want to just say, I am not a climate scientist. I am getting this from reading, and I am regurgitating to you what I read from climate scientists, okay? But in Russia, you have the world's largest forest is in Siberia, which does a whole lot of the oxygen production for our planet, and in doing so, obviously, is removing carbon, which is one of the primary causes of the greenhouse effect and one of the primary contributing factors to global warming. So as fires rage through those forests, you see, not only are you reducing that forest's ability to absorb carbon from the environment, you're also creating more carbon as you burn those trees. The carbon is released as you burn those trees, right? And then you have in the permafrost, you also have a lot of gases trapped in the permafrost, including carbon. So as that melts, you're also releasing carbon there. And this is just incredibly concerning. Permafrost covers a large portion of like the northern part of the northern hemisphere, if that kind of makes sense. It's basically it's frozen ground that the poles are surrounded by, right? And a lot of the carbon in our that exists on our planet or in our planet's environment as a whole exists in the permafrost and in these forests. So that Siberia, which is, kind of infamously freezing cold, is now experiencing this kind of heat and these kind of wildfires and seeing the permafrost melt, adds to all of the other things that we've been talking about. Sea level rises, floods, wildfires all around the country, heat waves in California and in the Pacific Northwest, right? The flooding in Europe, the flooding in New York, all this kind of stuff. The iceberg that broke off of Antarctica about a month ago, maybe a little more now, which is the size of Rhode Island and is the biggest iceberg in the world. And climate scientists have warned for quite some time that we would be crossing a line of no return if that iceberg were to break off. Well, it did, and now it's going to start melting because it's going to float into warmer areas. So time and again, we are seeing catastrophic things happening as it pertains to the climate. I have read a number of articles that say we are in a worse situation than the worst case scenarios estimated by climate scientists going back years. So we like, I don't even really want to say we need to act now. We needed to act years ago, decades ago. The urgency of this situation cannot possibly be overstated. You guys, we're seeing catastrophic results. 100 and some people died in the heat wave in the Northwest where I am. I'm in Washington State. Over 100 people died in that heat wave going back a few weeks, right? How many people died in the floods in Europe? I don't even know what that tolls up to. So as all of this continues and compounds an already horrendous problem, we're going to start seeing absolutely catastrophic results from the climate crisis that we have created and continue to refuse to address. And lastly, one other fun story here, you guys. I wanted to keep it a little bit light. I'm in a good mood, I guess, after that march yesterday. I'm feeling inspired, so keep it light and do some funny stories, I suppose, today. But Ben and Jerry's, very progressive as far as like a business goes. Ben Cohen was a co-chair for Bernie Sanders' campaign, and they've long espoused progressive politics. I believe Jerry's involved with Our Revolution too. I might have that wrong, but they're very invested in progressive politics in the United States. They came out and basically said, we're not going to sell our ice cream in the West Bank anymore because of the illegal settlements that Israel continues to engage in. And so we're basically gonna use our business leverage to say we're not going to sell in the West Bank anymore. Now, they are still selling ice cream in Israel, which some progressives have deemed to be problematic and perhaps take away from the gesture a little bit. But that they even refuse to sell in the illegally occupied West Bank has sparked all sorts of outrage among conservatives, and again reveals some hypocrisies here. So this is Ben Shapiro. I think the owners of Ben & Jerry's are awful politically, but they make a great ice cream, so I eat there because I'm not a vindictive asshole. He tweeted this in 2012. Okay, now I know we're going back a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit, whatever. So he's saying here, I will not engage in activism in the form of supporting or not supporting companies based upon their political views or their political impact, right? He's saying, I think it is, he's basically saying, vindictive assholes are the ones who engage in making economic decisions and consumption decisions based upon that company's morality or political views, right? It's vindictive assholes who do that, right? Well, now, fast forward to July 19th, 2021. Oh, well, guess I won't be eating any more of your ice cream. He says in response to Ben & Jerry's ending their sales of ice cream in the occupied Palestinian territory. This, you guys, it's the ultimate hypocrisy on behalf of these individuals who consistently call themselves free speech warriors. And and the left are the snowflakes who overreact and get reactionary and all this bloody blah. Free open marketplace of ideas, right? They say as they want to implement laws that disallow you from supporting BDS, like ultimate hypocrisy. So here's Ben displaying that rank hypocrisy for all of us to see. I picked on Ben Shapiro, but there were a number of other conservatives who were outraged by this as well. I wish, just to give my view on this, I really wish that making consumption decisions based upon political ethics and viewpoints was effective. But unfortunately, our system has created an environment where we very often don't have a choice. You might think you're looking at 20 different brands that sell some product. In many cases, that's like 2 or 3 conglomerates that own all of them. So I used to have this app. I wish I could remember what it was called, but you could scan barcodes at the grocery store and it would show you like the chain of companies up to the top, right? And almost all things in a grocery store, or I should say a majority of things in a grocery store, are owned by like a handful or 10 companies or something like that. So what choice do you really have? It's when I talked to Irami Ose Frimpong about the media, he brought up this metaphor of like, you can take your vegetarian friend out to eat and you can tell them, well, you have a choice. Look at the menu. See, you have choices. And they can look down at the menu and see chicken, lamb, beef, pork, and fish. And they're like, but none of those choices allow me to abide by my own principles. None of those choices give me the option to live by my own moral code. So if you constrain the choices, there's really no avenue to make a principled choice, right? And very often when it comes to consumption decisions, we don't have an ethical choice. We're forced into a box where we have to choose between immoral, unethical companies. So my view on this is, where it's actually pertinent, I very much support like not purchasing from a company that is, say, mistreating their workers. Like if you can avoid Frito-Lay, because they let their workers die on the line and commit suicide on the line, and then they keep overworking the rest of them, right? If you can avoid Amazon, avoid Amazon. Don't reward their treatment of their workers. But I'm just pointing out, often your other option there is like Walmart, right? Like, so it's very often the case that you don't have a truly ethical decision to make. And if you want to like have any sort of quality of life in the sense that you're participating in like buying the kind of food that we eat these days, or participating in activities, or buying technology or clothes or any of these other things, or vacations or any of these other, right? What airline is good? If you want to go to a certain destination, there's only 3 options and it's Delta, United, and American. What are you supposed to do, right? So very often the choice is truly not there. And therefore, I just don't really get too far into those consumption decisions. I don't condemn people for buying a food item that they like because they're, when all that they have is bad options. But Ben Shapiro here displaying his rank hypocrisy as, a whole plethora of conservative politicians do on this issue on a regular basis. So, very sorry that we could not bring you that Medea Benjamin clip. We're going to try to do our best to get that up somewhere, and I'll be posting about it and sharing it because I'd love to hear what Medea had to say. Huge shout out to John and Roxana and Jody, who were on the ground in DC again today, talking with people at that protest at that demonstration. They did fantastic work yesterday on the ground in DC, bringing us all sorts of great interviews. Shout out to everybody else who was on the ground for us in any of the other cities, and to all of the marchers out there, to all the people participating in this demonstration against the embargo on Cuba. Huge shout out to you. This is what we need to affect the changes that we're desperate for. Quick last plug, you guys, realprogressives.org right there. Please do go check out our work, our content, support our organization at Real Progress US, at RP_in_action, at Luke Parcher Show. Make sure you're not missing out on any of our fantastic content. We're going to try to get you that Medea Benjamin clip as soon as possible. And with that, I will call it a stream. You all have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next Sunday.